Hi everybody, in this video we're going to be talking about just some general aspects of behavior. And your objectives are over here on the left. And for our agenda, we're going to be talking about what we consider behavior or the definition of behavior. We're going to talk about labels. We're going to talk about operational definitions of behavior. We're going to talk about conditions, the teaching and learning model, functions of behavior, and then we're going to wrap it up talking briefly about the three-term contingency or our ABCs of behavior. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about the definition of behavior. So what exactly do we consider behavior? And from a behavior analytic perspective, we consider behavior everything that you do that can be observed. If we can observe it, then we can measure it. Anything that can be observed, we also think about it in terms of something that includes displacement in space through time that results in a measurable change in at least one aspect of the environment. So this, whatever we're considering behavior, has to make an impact on the physical world. And so these would be things such as texting, walking, jumping, talking, things like that. All those things make an impact on the physical world. We can observe them, we can measure them. So if we take something like anxiety, for instance, anxiety is just a state that your body is in. And because of that, we can't actually observe that, and it doesn't make an impact on the physical world. So we would not consider anxiety as being behavior. Another aspect of if we consider something behavior or not is if the person actually emits the behavior. So we have something that we call a dead man's test, and the saying is, if a dead man can do it, it ain't behavior. And I know that's not grammatically correct, but that's the saying. So if somebody comes up to you and picks up your arm, then we would not consider that behavior because you can go to a dead man and pick up a dead man's hand. So not only do we have to be able to observe behavior, but the person has to actually voluntarily emit the behavior. And if you don't like talking about a dead man, which I completely understand, we have another saying. It's the same concept. It's called the leaf test. And it says, if the leaf can do it, it is not behavior. And the big example for the leaf test is if a gust of wind comes and kind of blows you over, then we would not consider that behavior because a gust of wind can come and blow a leaf over as well. So same concept, whichever one you want to use, dead man's test or leaf test. Either one works. So let's do a little learning check. Which of the following are not behavior? Texting, being blown by the wind, laughing, burping, blowing a bubble, or anxiety. And your two answers for this question are being blown by the wind and anxiety. So being blown by the wind doesn't pass the leaf test or the dead man's test, and anxiety is not something that we can observe. It doesn't make an impact on the physical world. It's just a state that your body's in. But all the other ones we consider behavior: texting, laughing, burping, and blowing a bubble. They pass the dead man's test and we can observe them. Okay, when we talk about defining behavior, we want to be careful that we don't use labels. And labels are essentially they describe a collection of behaviors. And because of that, that collection of behaviors can be different from person to person. So if we take tantrums, for instance, we wouldn't measure a tantrum because a tantrum is a label. And a tantrum, if you ask people, other people, what they would consider a tantrum, you're going to get different answers from each of those people. Some people classify as tantrum as flopping on the floor, some crying and stomping, some flopping on the floor and hitting, some flopping on the floor and hitting and kicking. So you get kind of different answers from different people. So when we talk about, creating a definition of the behavior that we are going to observe and measure, we want to make sure that we stay clear of labels and we actually talk about the actual behavior that we are going to observe. And in that case, we need to operationally define the behavior. So that means describing the behavior or defining the behavior in terms of how we're going to actually measure it. So we're going to describe our observations so that others can repeat and measure what is being observed. And to create a really good operational definition of a behavior, we talk about it ascribing to 4 different things. First of all, you have to describe the behavior in an observable manner. Then you have to describe the behavior in measurable terms. You have to define the behavior in positive terms, and then be clear, concise, and complete. So let's go through each of these. The first one is that you need to use observable terms. So we are basically using observable terms, and the occurrence of that behavior is readily apparent to an observer. So you're basically describing what the behavior looks like. And when we talk about the form of the behavior or what it looks like, we're talking about the topography of the behavior. So you guys might hear me say the word topography as we go through the course. And when I say topography, I'm talking about the form of the behavior, what it actually looks like. You want to make sure that you avoid being subjective, so you don't want to use those labels, and you also don't want to use mentalistic explanations as well, such as we are going to measure anxiety or sadness or something like that. When we use those subjective terms, they can mean different things to different people, and they're really hard to measure. So that way, you know, if we are going to measure anxiety or being anxious, then the different people are going to measure different things, and our measurement system is not going to be reliable and valid. So be as objective as possible and describe what the behavior actually looks like. Another key thing to remember when using observable terms is to use action verbs. If you're using action verbs, you're actually describing what the person is doing, which is awesome. So, you know, organizing, exploring, selecting a picture, writing their name, whatever it is, think about those action verbs. And here are 2 questions that you guys can ask yourself to make sure that you're using observable terms. Does the definition describe the student's actions? And can I see or hear the behavior occurring as described? So once you write your behavioral definition, ask yourself these 2 questions to make sure that you actually use observable terms and you don't have any type of subjective or mentalistic terms in there. Also, remember, we're just describing what the behavior looks like. We're not trying to interpret why the behavior is occurring at this point. And yes, in the future classes or future videos, we are interested in why the behavior is occurring. But when we're just looking at the behavioral definition, we don't want to interpret it or put a why in there. We are simply just describing the form of the behavior or the topography so that we can actually measure it and figure out if it is a target behavior that we need to address and look at why it's occurring. But the first step is just defining the behavior and describing the form of the behavior. You don't want that why in there at this point. All right, second, use measurable terms. So define behavior in a way that you can count it or time it. And that allows us to quantify the behavior and graph it so we can make awesome treatment decisions. So you want to use the dimensions of behavior, and we'll talk about the dimensions of behavior in the measuring behavior video, but basically this is going to be your frequency, duration, latency measures, things like that. And you also want to select a behavior that will occur again during a time period. So basically you want to ask yourself, can I count the number of times the behavior occurs, or the number of minutes the behavior lasts, or the lapse time between the antecedent or, you know, an instruction from the teacher and when the kid actually starts to engage in the behavior. So if you have a behavioral definition and you answer yes to any of these, then you've used measurable terms, and therefore you can actually quantify the behavior and graph it. Next, we want to make sure we use positive terms. So we want to define behaviors in terms of what the student is doing or will do. So you want to avoid using not in your behavioral definitions. You don't want to define a behavior with regards to the absence of the behavior. So take this picture down here at the bottom right. We have little Johnny who's knocked over little Sally's blocks. So we don't want to define little Johnny's behavior as Johnny is not being nice. That's the absence of behavior. So a better definition would be something like Johnny forcefully kicks over his peers' toys. That defines the behavior in something in positive terms and what the student is actually doing. And a lot of times in the educational setting, teachers will say, Johnny's not walking down the hall. That's not a great behavioral definition. You want to state it in terms of what the student is doing. So Johnny is running down the hall. That would be our behavioral definition. And here are 2 questions that you guys can ask yourself to make sure you're using positive terms. Is the word not in your definition? And am I describing a behavior, not the absence of a behavior? Okay, and finally, you want to be clear, concise, and complete. So someone else should be able to quickly read your behavioral definition and use that information to measure the behavior with accuracy. So being clear means making sure it's readable and it's unambiguous. So there's no question as to what you're supposed to measure. Those subjective terms aren't in there that people can interpret different ways. It's readable and unambiguous. You want to make sure that it's concise, so all relevant information and the least amount of words. Take this example. During class, Joey makes inappropriate noises while the teacher is teaching the class. A better way to say this might be, during teacher-directed instruction, Joey makes inappropriate noises. That's more concise and better all around to understand. And then making sure that it's complete. So you state the conditions under which the behavior is occurring and the actual problem behavior. So for example, during 20-minute independent seat work literacy tasks, John talks with peers about non-instructional topics. So you stated these are the conditions under which the behavior occurs, and here is the actual problem behavior. All right, here are just 2 other good behavioral definitions of behavior. So the first one is studying, and you guys can think about what studying, how you would define studying for yourself. But for Ray, studying involves reading pages from a textbook, underlining sentences in the text, completing math or physics workbooks, exercises, reading notes from class, and outlining chapters from the text. You can see those action verbs in there, reading, outlining, reading up here, underlining. So we're actually describing what she's doing. We're using observable terms. We can measure these. You can measure, how long she reads, a duration, how many sentences she underlines, the frequency. It's stated in positive terms. These are behaviors that the student is actually doing, and it's clear and concise and complete. Here's one on nail biting. So nail biting is interesting. People think that it would be really easy to define, but you really have to, some people bite their actual nail, some people bite the cuticle around the nail, and so that's really important to define before you go in to measure the behavior, because you want to make sure that you have a really complete behavioral definition and there's no questions about it. So for Mark, this would be anytime Mark's finger is in his mouth and his teeth are close together on the fingernail, cuticle, or skin around the nail. It's defined as nail biting. So this tells us, regardless of whether he bites his cuticle or his actual fingernail, those are both instances of nail biting that we're recording. Okay, I wanted to briefly mention this, but a lot of times teachers like to talk about personality descriptors of the child or of a learner as opposed to actual definitions of behavior. So when we talk about actual definitions of behavior, we would say that the student, slept the whole time, read from a book, waited for others to speak, answered questions correctly, scored 80% on time math tests, things like that. Those are describing actual behaviors that the learner is engaging in. However, like I mentioned just a couple seconds ago, teachers like to talk about personality descriptors. So let us say, oh, that student was a jerk today, or that student was lazy, or off task, or defiant, or hyperactive. And what's interesting is that those personality descriptors, when we start to describe what kids are doing and type with regards to personality descriptors, those can often seem innate, and we wouldn't actually be able to change the kid's behavior. However, if we're talking about definitions of behavior, then these behaviors are things that we can change. It has kind of a different perspective to it. And so I want to kind of force you guys to not think about things in terms of, or not think about how your students are behaving in terms of personality descriptors. Because like I said, those kind of seem innate and we can't change them, but more or less think about what behaviors are they actually engaging in. And your book makes this point, which I think it's a good one, that the tendency exists for teachers to want to talk about student conditions rather than behavior. So they want to talk about those personality characteristics, or they want to talk about, if the student has a specific condition, they attribute the behavior to that condition. And labeling students like that, or kind of talking about the conditions as opposed to the actual behavior the kids are engaging in, it does give us that precise term, but a lot of teachers use it as an excuse. And so they'll say, he's not sitting in his seat because he has ADHD. And so they use that condition as an excuse. Whereas if you just focus on the actual behaviors, then you can actually look to the environment and change that. And those behaviors that you use the conditions as an excuse for actually need a more individualized treatment plan. So we would want to maybe go up to a tier 2 or a tier 3. And once again, we want to use those proactive strategies, make sure that we engage in our effective teaching, instructional and coping skills, things like that. But we don't just want to use conditions as an excuse for kids to engage in those types of behaviors. I wanted to talk really briefly about the teaching and learning model of behavior. So with this model, attention is focused on how behavior is adopted, maintained, and changed in the real world. And so teachers really want to focus on and consider how to promote novel behavior, appropriate behavior, maintain those appropriate behaviors, and then change and adapt maladaptive or inappropriate behaviors. And there's a distinct focus on the instructional relationship between the teacher, the teaching environment, and the student. So, we want to be able to say, hey, little Johnny, sit down, and he sits. Or, go up to the blackboard and do a problem, and he does, or the chalkboard, or maybe the smartboard more often these days. But, and so a lot of people think that when we do this, we're trying to control the child. And I guess that's true to an extent. We're trying to control the child in a way that they can actually engage in behaviors that promote learning and promote their own independence. So, if we can get the child to, when we say sit, to sit down, then that child now has opportunity to learn academic tasks that they can go and take into the real world and actually have more freedom. So we're not trying to control all aspects of the child. We are trying to teach them things that they can learn independently and take into their environment and have more success in their environment. It's based off of positive and proactive instruction. We want to make sure that we set our students up for success, arrange the environment in the way that makes them successful, use our effective instruction from the very beginning, and things like that. We don't just want to wait for them to fail to respond or to engage in these challenging behaviors and we have to react to them. We want to use those proactive strategies so we can prevent challenging behaviors. And then remember that with our teaching and learning model and our perspective of behaviorism, which we take in ABA, behavior is the result of learning in the environment. So the cause of behavior lies in the environment. If a kid is engaging in a maladaptive behavior or an inappropriate behavior, then it's not because of a personality characteristic or a condition or anything like that. It's something in the environment that is maintaining that behavior. So, and also, one other issue that your book brings up, which I think it's important, is we have to consider the degree to which a behavior warrants change. And that means that we're referring to what we call the social validity. So we have to ask ourselves, when we see an inappropriate behavior or a behavior that we think is inappropriate, do we have both a moral responsibility and an ethical right to change that behavior? We don't just pick behaviors to change and change them. That's not appropriate. And typically when we talk about having a moral responsibility or an ethical right to change a behavior, we're talking about behaviors that inhibit the academic or social learning of the student or his or her peers. So behaviors that just annoy you, that's not appropriate to change. We don't have an ethical right to change those. But behaviors that, really inhibit that academic learning or social learning, those are the ones that we do have an ethical right to change. All right, and those are the behaviors that warrant focus and intervention. Okay, so why does a behavior persist? If you have a kid that's engaging in a challenging behavior or an inappropriate behavior, and he's just doing it all the time, this gets into the why. Why is he doing it? Why is that behavior persisting? And, if it just happens once, it's not that big of a deal. It could be an accident. He could have saw somebody else do it and he's imitating them. It could be a mental health condition, or you might never know. A lot of times, learners and kids can't tell you why they engage in a behavior, but if they did it once, probably not a big deal. But if it continues to happen, then it typically serves some type of function. So it's persisting, it's being reinforced somehow. Remember, the cause of the behavior is in the environment. So something in the environment is reinforcing that behavior. And typically the kid is engaging in the behavior to get something that he likes. So he wants more of something, or avoid something that he doesn't like, and he gets to escape that task. Now, it could also be due to mental health reasons, and in that case, we wouldn't use these behavior techniques that we're going to talk about in this course. But if you have a behavior that serves some type of function, getting something that they like or avoiding something that they don't like, those are the behaviors that we're talking about. And those behaviors have a function. There's a reason why. Something in the environment is reinforcing that behavior. So most behaviors of concern in the classroom do have that discernible function. And your book has listed some subcategories of those two functions that we just talked about. So remember, access to something that they like, or escape or avoidance to something that they don't like. And this can happen with tangibles. So these are kind of concrete items, food, iPads, things like that. They can engage in the behavior to access a tangible or to avoid a tangible that they don't want. They could engage in behavior to access attention or avoid attention from peers or an adult. Or an activity. They could engage in a challenging behavior to engage in an activity that they want, or to get out of an activity that they don't want to do. And remember, behaviors are maintained by things that happen in the environment. So our teaching and learning model, our perspective, is that the cause of behavior is in the environment. So we're looking at the relationship between behavior and the environment. So if a behavior is persisting and continuing to occur, something in the environment is reinforcing that behavior. It serves some function, and these are the main subcategories. The functions are access or escape, and these are the main subcategories that you guys will see when you observe what happens in the environment after the behavior occurs. And behavior persists because it works. Like I mentioned, it's getting reinforced from the environment. The environment is reinforcing that behavior. It works. It gets them something that they want or gets them out of something that they don't want. So it's going to continue to occur. I wanted to go over two terms with you guys that y'all hear throughout the course. First one is stimulus. And when we talk about stimuli, these are all the things that can occur in the environment. So objects, people, events, and actions. And then we talk about responses. Those are behaviors. So the behavior is the responses to those stimuli by the learner. And so when behaviors result in good things for us, we want to do them again. And we refer to that as reinforcement. So with reinforcement, something happened after a behavior to make it more likely to occur again. So you engage in the behavior and then something changes in the environment, or some type of these stimuli change, which makes it more likely for the behavior to occur again. And then another common procedure that we typically talk about is punishment. So this is when something happens after a behavior to make it less likely to happen again. And so if your behavior is increasing, it's probably been reinforced. If your behavior is decreasing, it's been punished or placed on extinction as well, which we'll talk about. But and I did want to make a side note. We'll talk about punishment later on in the course, but our definition of punishment is a functional definition. We're talking about, just like it says on the slide, it's a procedure where something happens after a behavior which makes it less likely to happen again, which is really different than the everyday definition of punishment, which means that you're actually physically harming the child and things like that. So our definition of punishment is very different than the everyday definition by society. All right, with the stimuli and responses, we relate that to what we call our three-term contingency, or our ABCs of behavior. So we're always looking at this relationship between behavior and the environment. The antecedents are stimuli that occur in the environment right before the behavior occurs. Then we have the behavior, and then we have the consequences. So what happens in the environment right after the behavior occurs. And when we're talking about the function or why the behavior occurs, we're mostly talking about this consequence. So the behavior occurs and then the child gets something that they want or avoids something that they don't want. And this consequence is the why the behavior is persisting and what is going on when we talk about the function of the behavior. Antecedents are also really important. Antecedents predict what consequence will occur and if the consequence is more likely to happen or not. So we're looking at these three-term contingencies and these ABCs of behavior. And the antecedents and consequences are stimuli in the environment, and the behavior is actually the response from the learner. So, all right, guys, we talked about the definition of behavior, everything you do that we can observe. We talked about labels and how we want to make sure that we don't include labels when we try to define a behavior that we're going to observe and measure. We talked about operational definitions of behavior, making sure that you're stating the definition of the behavior in observable terms, measurable terms, positive terms, and you're being clear, concise, and complete. We talked about conditions and how teachers like to talk about the conditions of the condition that a certain kid has and attribute their inappropriate behavior to that condition, and how that's really just an excuse, and that we should really be looking at the certain behaviors that the kid is engaging in because the cause of the behavior is in the environment and we can change those behaviors. If we attribute it to a condition, then we kind of think that it's innate or something that we can't change, and that's not the case. We talked about the teaching and learning model, and then we talked about the functions of behavior. So why behavior persists, it serves some function. It either gets the kids something that they want or lets them escape something that they don't like. And then we wrapped it up with talking about stimuli and responses and how that relates to our three-term contingency or our ABCs of behavior. So, all right, guys, please let me know if you have any questions when you're watching this video, and thank you guys for listening.